Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. For a video, which if you've seen the title, you're probably saying to yourselves, yeah, obviously science fiction and fantasy are not the same things. Because they're not, Roger. Science fiction and fantasy are not the same thing. But it's not quite so cut and dried as that. At least it wasn't for a long time. It was only about 100 years ago that science fiction emerged as a genre under the name science fiction. Before that, science fiction and fantasy kind of existed in the same realm, let's say. Even though science fiction as a genre existed before it was called science fiction. It goes back a long way. But there is a distinction. They are different things. And I think the distinction between the two is important. Now, when it comes to fiction, if we're looking at it in its broadest sense, all fiction is fantasy. All of it. Because it's all made up. All fiction is made up in the minds of human beings. At least all real fiction. I know AI is doing imitation fiction now, but all real fiction is made up in the minds of human beings. And even fiction that means to be realistic can be pretty unrealistic. And there has always been fiction that has been realistic fiction and unrealistic fiction. Fiction that is mundane, literature of the mundane, and literature of the fantastic. Science fiction and fantasy have always existed in the literature of the fantastic. The literature of the mundane, I don't mean to say that as if that was boring, although, it can be pretty boring sometimes, but that is just literature that means to exist in a world like our own. It intends to resemble the real world as it is or as it was in the past. Whereas the literature of the fantastic presents you with things that do not and cannot exist in the real world. And that includes science fiction, fantasy, and occasionally horror. I've always enjoyed the literature of the fantastic a little bit more. But for a long time, they were lumped together, like I said, until about the 1920s. But then science fiction did emerge as its own genre. And important distinctions can be made between science fiction and fantasy and indeed horror. The three streams, if you will, of the literature of the fantastic. So we've got fantasy, popular fantasy right here. We've got science fiction. Look at that. That's awesome. That's Ice World by Hal Clement. Science fiction, and this is Astounding Science Fiction, a publication that helped establish what science fiction actually is. And then we've got horror. This is James Herbert. James Herbert, depending on which book he's writing, he could be writing about the supernatural. He could be writing about science fiction. Usually it's all horror. Horror is usually part of the literature of the fantastic, but has supernatural elements in it. So horror doesn't have to. Horror as a genre is more about the feeling, the mood, and the intent of the fiction. Its intent usually is to frighten you, or to make you feel uneasy, to fill you with suspense and dread. Horror has an object in mind, and it can use all the tools of the literature of the fantastic or the literature of the mundane to create the effect that it's going for. Science fiction, fantasy, those are different. So what makes science fiction and fantasy different things? Well, science fiction is different from fantasy in that in science fiction, much like in the real world, there is no such thing as magic or the supernatural. Now, in the real world, of course, I know there are people who will disagree with this, and you can go ahead and disagree. But in the real world, there's no such thing as magic or the supernatural in any form. Roger and I know this very well because, after all, I did resurrect Roger using dark sorcery and the Necronomicon. So if anybody knows, it's us. So yeah, no such thing as magic in the supernatural. Right, Roger? Anyway, the same thing in science fiction. Science fiction is full of fantastic things that cannot or do not exist in the real world. Time travel, going to other planets, aliens, all kinds of stuff. And it's true that some of the things in science fiction are so fantastical that they pretty much resemble magic, but they're not. Things in science fiction all conform to natural laws. At least that's the intent. Science fiction writers very often don't get the science right. Sometimes that's because they're writing at a time when the things they're writing about, they just don't know. Like if they're writing about Venus and aliens on Venus when they don't know what's on Venus because they're writing 100 years ago. It's still science fiction. It also could be that the writer of science fiction just sucks and doesn't do their research or just doesn't get the science right. That's fine. They're still trying to write science fiction. They're still trying to write about a world and a universe which is governed by natural laws. Nothing unnatural happens in it. As soon as you enter magic or the supernatural, the story is no longer science fiction. It has become something else. I just sneezed, but they'll never know because I edited it out. I'm sneaky. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. It becomes something else. It becomes fantasy. Most people, when they think of fantasy, they're thinking about dragons and fantasy worlds like Middle Earth or wherever. Fantasy, I think for most modern audiences, they think of a certain kind of thing. But fantasy as a genre is pretty broad. And it can encompass all kinds of different writing. Basically, what you need in fantasy to make it fantasy is a world that is so fantastic that it cannot exist, or a world in which magic exists, or the supernatural exists. These things move it away from science fiction. This is the big split right there. This is what makes them two different genres. Sometimes you have a science fiction, or what seems to be a science fiction story, but magic is in there. And that makes it fantasy. Sometimes you could have a story that just has a bunch of elements that you'd normally find in fantasy, but there's no magic. And actually the fantasy elements are caused by science fiction stuff. Then even though everything looks like fantasy, it's science fiction. That is the distinction. Star Wars, for example, has the Force, which is pretty much magic. Star Wars is a fantasy. It doesn't matter how many spaceships you have flying around, it's fantasy, basically. Because of the Force, because it's got magic in it. It has a bunch of trappings of science fiction, but it's fantasy. You get a lot of books like that too. But that is the distinction. And it's important because it affects the story that you're reading. Science fiction stories very often are speculating on the possible. These things, no matter how unlikely They could be possible, at least at the time that the stories are written. Sometimes you're stretching a point, but they could at least be possible. Everything in the stories is supposed to be at least governed by natural laws, even if the writer gets those things wrong. Middle Earth, however, it's full of magic and spells and things like that that can never exist in a natural world. That's fine. But it's fantasy. It's a different type of story. The reasons fantasy and science fiction, like I said, are often lumped together is because they are the literature of the fantastic. And it took a long time for these things to be split apart in people's minds as well as in publishers' minds. Even nowadays, you can go to a bookstore, the few that still exist, and very often fantasy and science fiction are lumped together under fantasy and science fiction. And that's fine, because they are both, the literature of the fantastic. That's the fun part of the bookstore. That's the part Roger and I go to first, I have no problem with other types of fiction, of course, but that's the fun stuff. Horror, poor horror, it can exist in its own genre, or sometimes that's spread out in just the general fiction, And that's because horror can be all kinds of things. Science fiction and fantasy tend to be a little bit closer, at least in bookstores. And I think the distinction is important. It can be a little hard to see sometimes. Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote A Princess of Mars before the term science fiction was commonly used. In that book, everything in it can be considered science fiction, except how did John Carter get to Mars? It's pretty vague. It could be magic. We never really know in A Princess of Mars whether it's magic or science fiction or something, that's caused by science of some kind that brings him to the planet. Since Edgar Rice Burroughs usually tried to find rational reasons for everything in his stories, no matter how fantastic they were, he went out of his way to find, rational explanations, or at least, scientific explanations for everything in his stories, even if it was pretty wild. That makes me think that what he had actually in mind was not magic. But we don't know. There are some stories like that. I just read one. I just read The Moon Pool, which is a lot of fun, by A. Merritt. Again, this is a book that was written before the term science fiction was commonly used. It was written before the 1920s. Very much influenced by the books of H.G. Wells and Edgar Rice Burroughs and some other writers writing at the time, like H. Rider Haggard. It's a lost world adventure, but a really, really fantastic one. I mean, there's some bizarre stuff in here. And reading this book, you wonder, with some of the things that happen in this book, whether this is science fiction or is it a fantasy. A lot of people term it science fantasy because it could be either one, perhaps. Again, in this book, much like A Princess of Mars, everything could have a rational explanation, but you kind of have to decide that in your own mind where it fits. There are books like that where you don't really know. They kind of fit in either genre, and that can make it kind of difficult if you're really, really concerned about whether it's science fiction or fantasy. There are plenty of books where, you have to decide for yourself whether they fit in one genre or the other. Where at other times, it's pretty cut and dried, Everything in here is science fiction. And I do think the distinctions are important. when you're reading the book to help ground you in whatever world you're reading about. How important it is, kind of up to you, you know. And yeah, you can make an argument that every magical thing that happens in a fantasy could just be science that we don't understand yet. Sure, you could say that. I'm not sure how helpful that is. Usually science fiction at least attempts to explain things, no matter how fantastic they are, you know. It tries to explain things in a rational scientific manner, like these things could exist. Whereas with magic, supernatural magic, that's a whole other world. It's a fun one. But like I said, magic and the supernatural can never exist in the real world. It's completely separate. Right, Roger? Roger agrees. So there you go. That's all I'm going to say about the subject. For me, I've always probably leaned a little more towards science fiction, but I enjoy them both. And, you know, my favorite writer of all time, Robert E. Howard, wrote predominantly fantasy and horror stuff. So, you know, it just depends on the writer. And then there's H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote both. He started off as a supernatural horror writer and a fantasy writer who slowly over time became a science fiction writer. You know, there are authors like that too. If he had lived longer, I suspect he would have become a science fiction writer, but who knows? Who knows? I'll shut up now, Roger, because now I'm just going on and on. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.